Welcome to the Tuesday edition of Juan's World. I had a momentary thought that I might do some cooking for you today because I made a special cottage pie that involved spinach and all kinds of other exotic things with pork, ground meat, and I made a crumble with guava and passion fruit again. But you know, that's just chameleon cook stuff, and I will eventually get there. Today I want to return to race and ethnicity, and this time I want to focus more on ethnicity, where last time I focused more on race. If you saw my last video, you'll know that I made the argument that biological race simply does not exist, and that what we normally call race in United States, United Kingdom, and so forth is really ethnicity. But there are problems with how to define ethnicity and why we use it instead of race and so forth. So I need to get into that side of things a little more. Well, just to recap, there are no conclusive biological markers for what gets called race. There are some general physical characteristics that get bundled in, including skin color, eye shape and color, hair color, and whatnot. But as I pointed out last time, those physical characteristics, which are determined genetically, have nothing to do with behavior at all. They're just not connected. That's one thing. And the second thing is that when you actually look at the peoples of the world, you find an incredible variety in those features like skin color, eye color, and whatnot. That they're just not useful markers for what we call race. And maybe you'll recall that at the end of the video I made the statement that if you believe that races exist, you are a racist. Now, I didn't mean that you were prejudiced against different racial categories as you define them, but that you defined them. And that's enough. That means that you believe races really exist. And I wouldn't be surprised if you think that races exist, that you also think that certain behaviors cluster with certain races. And so that also would put you in my category of racist. And what I said was that the alternative is to talk about ethnicity. Now, ethnicity is not a biological characteristic, it is a cultural characteristic. We're saying these people are ethnically African American or Italian American or Irish American. The United States has a habit of hyphenating everything, but we could just more generally speak about people being ethnically Irish or ethnically Scottish or ethnically English. And there we have both a solution and a problem, because there's a lot of ways in which the Irish, Scots, and English are very similar. And then there are ways in which they are different. And that a person who is Scottish, for example, identifies usually as Scottish as opposed to English. That they are seen as oppositional ethnicities. And of course, racially, you could say, well, maybe I can distinguish them because there are more blue-eyed redheads in Scotland than there are in England or whatever. But the physical characteristics are largely an irrelevance. It's the social or cultural characteristics that define ethnicities. The other factor that makes things complex is that these ethnicities often get identified with nationality. And that's a real problem because ethnicity and nationality are different. Although in Europe there has been a long contested battle all across the continent from those political factors who want to build large national blocs and those ethnicities that want to have their own nation. A good example would be the Basques. The Basques occupy a territory in the Pyrenees, on the coast, partly in Spain, partly in France. They have their own distinctive language, Basque, which has nothing to do with Indo-European languages. They have their own cultures in all kinds of respects. But they are divided as a people, as an ethnicity, between the nation of Spain and the nation of France. And they want to build a border around their land and govern it themselves as Basques. And the Catalans in Spain would like to do the same. They would like to separate out from Spain and be designated as ethnically and politically Catalan. And this has been going on at minimum since 1815, when the Treaty of Vienna, which concluded the Napoleonic Wars, decided that the best way to avoid similar kinds of wars was to build nations that were balanced, and one particular nation would not be powerful enough to do what Napoleon did, just kind of sweep across the continent, moving all asunder. And so they built blocks. Some of them were easy enough to define, like Spain and France. The German states created a problem, and the Italian states created a problem, but in the 19th century, both of those eventually unified into nation states. But Austria-Hungary contained all kinds of ethnicities. I mean, not just that it contained ethnically Germanic people and ethnically Magyar or Hungarian people, but it contained all of the various Slavic groups, and there were pockets of Bosnians and all manner of people that each wanted to be separate, but were forcibly unified under one ruler to create a power block. So let's see if we can divide ethnicity away from nationality and identify it as an anthropological concept that is usable. So one of the ways we can think about ethnicity is by co-opting a term that was very common in anthropology for a long time, the concept of culture, although that's now not as useful as it used to be. But a culture at one time was defined as a group of people who share certain things, certain beliefs, certain ideas, also share a language, or we could say, in terms of ethnicity, we could say share a dialect of a language, share certain calendar customs, share certain ideas about what is right and wrong, and probably, but not always, ideas about who we are as opposed to who they are, which we sometimes call the in-group and the out-group. Although that also does not necessarily accurately map onto ethnicity, but there is definite sense of there is us and there is them. This is who we are, and we are different from them. And the differences may be physical, and certainly what used to be called racial characteristics would be included in there, but more importantly, the culture is defined in terms of behaviors, and language being one of the most significant. That's why the Catalans identify themselves as different from other parts of Spain, and the Basques too. Catalan is an Indo-European language, but it's not mutually intelligible with Castilian. I don't understand Catalan at all. Very interesting nation, Spain, that the languages that are spoken within Spain are more different from one another than all of the Spanish dialects in the diaspora. So that, for example, I speak Rioplatense, the Buenos Aires dialect of Spanish, and I can go to Chile or Ecuador or Bolivia, Uruguay, and I understand people. Yeah, the dialects are a little bit different. I have to use a slightly different vocabulary perhaps, and some grammar rules are different. But it's nothing in comparison with Castilian Spanish versus Andalusian or Galician or Catalan. They are very, very different dialects / languages. So language is really an important factor. That we speak this dialect or this kind of language, and they speak something else. Historically, it's very common for groups to say, well, our language is better than other people's language. In fact, in Greek, the term for a non-Greek in ancient times was barbaros. And the purported etymology of barbaros, which gives us barbarian, right, or barbaric, is that it was onomatopoeic, like ba 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 ba. When they speak, they say ba 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 ba. It's unintelligible, so they are the barbaro, barbaros, or the barbaroi, plural. That inherently within the concept of ethnicity is the concept that our group is not just distinct from other groups, but it's also better than other groups. So built into ethnicity is a hierarchy of values. All right. All of that said, I want to just, for the moment, touch on why ethnicity works better than race. And I'm going to look first at the concept of Hispanic, or sometimes we say Ladino, and the problems that have arisen from trying to think of being Hispanic in racial terms. There was a time, starting I believe in the 1960s, when people of Latin American heritage living in the United States and lumped together as like one thing, Hispanic, and many people in the United States calling everybody who was Hispanic, calling them Mexican, still do in fact, because like they're the closest neighbors, and so everybody, even if they're from the Dominican Republic or Ecuador or whatever, they're Mexicans. Well, in the 1960s, there was a movement to designate all those people as la raza. La raza is the Spanish word for race. And also on some forms in the United States, there is a series of boxes to check which are supposedly race, and they would include of African descent, of Asian descent, Pacific Island, Native American, all things that might be conceived of in physical racial terms, but it also includes Hispanic, and sometimes it's divided up into black Hispanic and white Hispanic or whatever. But I don't think it takes much effort to realize that Hispanic is not a physical racial designation, because if you look in Latin America, you see multiple physical characteristics, and I talked a little bit about them last time in Argentina. There's rubio, that's me, I'm like white, and moreno, which is brown. Negro is also indio. Like, we're all Hispanic, but we don't share physical characteristics. What we share is a language. We don't even really completely share cultural characteristics, although by and large Latin America, because it was colonized by Spanish and Portuguese, is predominantly Catholic. So certain festivals, the Immaculate Conception, Easter, Christmas, and so forth, they tend to be very stable throughout Latin America, and certain Catholic values in general tend to be very widespread. But it's really not fair to use a term like la raza to mean the Hispanic race. It's not a race, it's an ethnicity. Or we can take Jewish. There's been several important questions asked, particularly in the 20th century when Israel was formed, and one of the purposes of Israel was to have a homeland for Jews. And the question that was asked at the outset in terms of immigration was, who is a Jew? And the answer is not simple, because racially, which is what groups like Nazis wanted to argue, things are complicated. Yes, people inherit being Jewish from their parents, most especially from their mother, but that does not define a race. That does define people genealogically, but not racially. And if you look at Jewish populations across the world, you find that they come in all manner of physical types. What unites them, and again being a bit simplistic here, what unites them is a religion. Now, where it gets complicated is that you can be a Jew without practicing Judaism. But we can also be more general here and say that I could, let's say, suggest that you are ethnically Christian. Again, I'm going to have to be a little wary here. But if you celebrate Christmas, all right, you may not have a lot of Christian symbols on your Christmas tree, and of course the Christmas tree is not in the Bible, but you probably might have a nativity in the house, even though you're not a believing Christian. You'll also probably celebrate Easter in some fashion. But in some ways, your ethnicity defines Easter and Christmas as significant holidays. Whereas if you're Jewish, then Passover, Rosh Hashanah, and so forth are your ethnic festivals. And we can look at other cultural markers like that to define how somebody sits ethnically. Now, the most important difference between thinking in terms of ethnicity and thinking in terms of race is that ethnicity is learned behavior. It's not built in, it's not genetic. And there is a degree to which you can change ethnicity. Not easy. Now, when you're born, you don't choose your ethnicity. It's already there in your parents and in the people around you. But it is learned behavior. Simple example, the language that you speak. You're not born with a proclivity to speak Chinese if you have Asian characteristics, or to speak English if you have European characteristics, or Spanish, or whatever. You speak whatever language you're immersed in when you're born, and you adopt cultural characteristics that surround you when you're being raised, and you don't question them right away. you don't look around and say, "Oh, I don't want to speak English. This is horrible. I'd much rather speak German or Japanese." You learn it, and if your parents are devout Catholics, you go to church and you probably get confirmed and all the rest of it. If you're Jewish, then you go to temple and so on. But the important thing about thinking of ethnicity in terms of culture rather than biology is that it can change. You can decide that you don't want to be ethnically a certain way and quite consciously become something else. It's a very, very important part of the concept of ethnicity. Now, there's more to it than I can possibly squeeze into one small video, so I'm going to continue at some point. But for the moment, I do want to just make the distinction as clear as possible that race as a biological term is not only bankrupt, but useless, and that ethnicity is a cultural rather than a biological term and has a great many values over the concept of race. I will say that by and large, when people talk about race these days, they're actually talking about ethnicity. I don't know quite how to solve that because it's pretty well embedded into the consciousness of people who care about these things. But ethnicity is a much better term, but it also has its problems. And I'll go there next time. And meanwhile, tell your friends, like and subscribe, and we'll continue on Friday.